Welcome to the University Aula. It's a great pleasure to be allowed to welcome you here. My name is Svein Stølen. I'm the rector of the University of Oslo. 1 year ago at this scene, Håvard Danielsen received from the King the Cancer Society's Prize for Research. He was using artificial intelligence to take picture of tumors, to understand tumors, and to produce prognosis. In September, Emmanuel Carpentier is coming to Oslo, Nobel Prize winner in medicine, doing CRISPR technology, in the interface between biotechnology and nanotechnology. Myself, I'm a materials chemist, and I know to what extent nanotechnology has affected battery technology, the fact that we have a lot of electric cars in Norway. This really is extremely important for renewable energy and the changes that we are going to see. Enabling technology, ICT, bio, nanotechnology are making enormous impact on society. Most people do not know too much about it. Politicians may not know about it, but there are extreme effects of enabling technologies. And then, of course, what we see that CRISPR is not necessarily only a positive technology. What are the limitations of what you can do with medicine? ChatGPT is a new technology. In March, we celebrated that we were able to use OpenAI to automatically text videos at the University of Oslo. Universal design, very efficient. Still, what we also see is that this technology is really accelerating, and we see that there are challenges for education, but also for society, of course. How does this affect polarization, echo chambers? How do this possibly increase social inequality? How does this possibly interfere with the political system? And that is the topic of today. How does artificial intelligence and technology possibly interfere with politics? We are going to have a conversation between Francis and Mathilde. We are looking forward to that, of course. Is it a curse, or is it a blessing, or is it something in between? After the conversation, there will be prepared questions from the audience. There's not going to be open questions, but there are prepared questions. So with this, I really welcome you again to University Aula, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this introduction, and good morning, and welcome to all of you. And of course, welcome to you, Frank. Last time you were here was right before the COVID pandemic hit Europe, I mean by a couple of weeks. It was dark. And since then, Russia has invaded Ukraine. And you usually talk about all these things all the time because they are huge things happening in the world right now. But today we are talking about something else, something that you proposed that we should talk about, and I'm really happy to say that it's going to be maybe the first time we're talking in an audience like this about these things. So we're going to have to see what AI, biotechnology, and technology in general, how that affects and how that influences global politics. A while ago, you wrote in American Purpose a blog post called AI Technology and Equality, and you explored possible social impacts of AI. And even if you say, or you said in that article, that it's a fool's errand to predict something, the long-term, for instance, social consequences of AI and technology, can you just tell me what we know so far about the overall effect of social media, internet, and technology on democracy so far? So we could start there.
Well, so first of all, it's a delight to be back at the University of Oslo and to see a lot of old friends here in Norway. I'm glad we can travel again, and thank you, Mathilde, for organizing this. So, first of all, let me say something. I think everybody here has been reading the stream of articles of people opining about what the effect of AI is going to be on society. And I'm not going to try to do that because I think it's just a fool's errand to try to make these predictions. If you think about what it was like in the 1870s when electricity was first invented, and if you had social media back then, and people would start speculating about what the impact of electricity would be on society as a whole, they wouldn't have had any idea. And I think we're in a similar position right now, that you can see certain trends, you can extrapolate them, but the thing is moving very, very quickly, and the ultimate social impacts, I think, are going to be very hard. We can talk more specifically about some particular dangers that I think we need to think about with regard to AI. But to get back to the bigger question, that blog post that Mathilde referred to was really one where I was trying to look back at the impact of earlier generations of digital technology, because I think that it's sometimes misunderstood what had really happened. So let's just think about the internet in general. We can get to, excuse me, social media. But if you think about this big transformation that has occurred over the last 50 years with the rise, excuse me, of this whole class of information technologies, there's a broad conclusion by economists that it has increased socioeconomic inequality. And there's doubtless a lot to this, because right now the main social divide in most countries, certainly in most advanced democracies, is one that is really based on education. And if you have a higher education, if you've gone to the University of Oslo, or you have a degree or a higher degree, you're doing well. Your income is much higher, and the gap between those people and people with just a high school education or less has grown enormously almost everywhere. And so there's no question that a lot of the current populism that we see around the world is based exactly on that division, that people that vote for populist politicians are usually less educated people. They don't live in big cities. They are not connected to a kind of larger global economy. And that obviously is really upsetting our democratic politics. However, one of the consequences that I don't think people have recognized sufficiently actually is this massive increase in inequality that was brought about by the transition from an industrial to a post-industrial economy, and that concerns gender relations, right? Because with the replacement of physical labor by machines, and then with the shift in the nature of work from an industrial economy to a post-industrial one in which most people, instead of working in factories or lifting heavy objects, they're sitting in front of computer screens all day in a service industry. This has had an enormous impact on the role of women in the economy. So beginning in the late 1960s, virtually every advanced society began to see enormous increases in female labor force participation. Now, some people would say this was an ideological change or a cultural change, that there was a movement for women's equality that appeared at that time. This is one of those areas where I think cause and effect are very hard to disentangle, and it is certainly the case that you could not have had the degree of female empowerment if you didn't have occupations for women where they could earn salaries, support families, and be independent of their husbands. And this began to happen as tens, hundreds of millions of women all over the world entered the workplace in that period in the late 20th century. Now, this shift, the one book I wrote that got the least attention was one called The Great Disruption that I published, I think, in about 1999 or so. Yeah. But I argued that there actually not just this change in the nature of work, but also, the invention of the birth control pill and other biomedical technologies that really shifted the whole nature of the family and gender relations. So women were empowered. There was an increase in the divorce rate. There was an increase in the number of children being brought up in single-parent families. But there's also a big class division that appeared as a result of this, because, in fact, for educated middle-class people, that disruption wasn't that great, but it was really bad for working-class people, where, to this day, a lot of children are being brought up in female-headed families. All of this brought about by the technology, but in the end, it had this enormous impact on the role of women in any modern economy, and indeed, really around the world, this change has gone on. And so the consequences of technological change are really very complicated and very hard to foresee. And I think that in that respect, the shift to digitization has had both positive and negative impacts, but it's very hard to say that overall, it's simply increased inequality.
You mentioned a book from 1998, and I'll bring up a book from 2003, another one. That's 20 years to this year. You wrote a book called Our Post-Human Future, Consequences of the Biotechnology Revolution. And how do you see that the ability to change or modify human behavior or biology will affect liberal democracy? And how do you think that new advances in biotechnology will affect politics and society? Because now you have the insight, you can look at what you wrote 20 years ago, and I'm sure lots of things have happened in this area as well. So tell me about biotechnology changes.
So in the late 90s, I was running a seminar on new technologies and their impact, and we focused on both IT and biotech. And at that time, I actually thought that the biotech revolution could be more consequential. And I think it still may be right, though in the interim, obviously, we've seen the downsides of social media and information technology. But the reason that I think that the biotech revolution could have big political effects is the tools that it provides for certain people to control the behavior of other people. We had the experience of totalitarianism in the 20th century, in which you had highly centralized, strong governments that tried to control the behavior of their populations, and they had things like agitation and propaganda. They had re-education. They had a police state that tried to enforce behavior changes in behavior in people. And in the end, those technologies were not sufficient. The Soviet Union broke down. China is now reinventing itself as a centralized controlling state, but it also has had trouble really using those techniques to control populations. But it seemed to me that these new biomedical technologies were opening up new avenues, and in particular, if you could actually do germline interventions that would alter certain characteristics of human nature that then would be heritable to later generations, that would have a very serious impact on the way that we thought about things like human rights, because I believe, I can go into a longer defense of this if anyone's interested, but I believe that our understanding of human rights is ultimately based on a certain theory we may have implicitly or explicitly about human nature, and that the most important rights that we grant people are those that respond to the deepest, aspects of what we regard to be a human being. And if you can start to manipulate that, you can change the nature of rights. You will, in the end, change the nature of rights. Germline engineering is not the only technology. I think that we are using psychopharmacological interventions, different kinds of drugs to control mood, behavior, and so forth. And it's been a major revolution. I think, these days we control the behavior of our children with SSRI, with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac and Xanax and so forth. We control children's behavior through Ritalin and other amphetamines like that, and it's going to increase. But it turned out that the IT revolution produced, bigger short-term impacts, and I think that's really what we've been worried about. I think when the internet and social media were first introduced, I, like many other people, thought this would be good for democracy because information was power, and if you increased access to information, you would spread power out, and that would be democratizing. It turned out that this was true. We were spreading power out, but we also were eliminating all the hierarchical structures that certified, verified, and ensure the quality of the information that we receive. And I think the big challenge that we have now is really the basic lack of trust that has pervaded, a lot of our societies, because we no longer disagree just about ultimate values. We are not able to agree on simple factual information. And you can see this, I think quite strongly in the United States, where we have this incredible degree of polarization, and it's ultimately built around the fact that the two sides of this polarization simply have different understandings of what's going on in the world, right? We have one group of conservative Republicans that think that Donald Trump had the election stolen from him in 2020, and they believe this very passionately, because when they turn on Fox News and go to their internet websites or their favorite people on Twitter, that's the story that they hear, and no amount of contrary information actually can get them off of this belief, because they really begin from a different factual basis. And that, I think, is really one of the dangers, at least, of the coming AI revolution, where the verifiability of virtually any digital artifact is going to be very difficult. So I do a lot of, photography, videography, this sort of thing. So Adobe just introduced this new beta version of Photoshop that has this thing called generative fill, where it used to be that, if you wanted to take somebody out of a picture, they had a tool that would, it would draw a line around that person and you could get rid of them, but it would just leave this blank white space. And now the program actually fills in the background, whatever, the person standing behind ahead of a brick wall, and it'll draw the bricks, in back of them. It'll even put objects that weren't there into the picture. And it's very hard to tell that you've actually manipulated it. And so this is, just the beginning, I think, of one stream of developments that is already with us, in terms of deep fakes, where it's going to be very hard to authenticate any kind of digital document. I think that one of the general characteristics of our age is a across-the-board decline of trust in social institutions. This has been well documented in a lot of surveys across many societies, where people simply do not believe in traditional institutions and their authority. And I think you imagine what's going to happen in court cases, for example. You say, well, we have photographic evidence that this person was guilty of this particular crime because, look, in fact, we've got a case of this with Donald Trump. We've got these photographs of him having these classified documents in his Mar-a-Lago resort, and already people are saying, well, these were doctored photographs. The FBI simply created this, and it's, they're fakes. And I think this is going to get more and more intense as the quality of the kinds of interventions that you can make will increase.
So when I look at your Instagram post next time, I have to just call you and see, have you manipulated this, or is this true? Were you really here or there? Go into the post-human future again with biotech, because I remember that you wrote something about differences between the West and China when it comes to manipulating things, and I'd like you to elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, I think that one of the problems in regulating, well, okay, let me back up a little bit. So I think that if you look at the history of technology, it's always been this race between the technological development and then the ability of science to regulate it, and it always takes a long time for that to happen. And this, you go back to the printing press when Gutenberg invented movable type. This had a lot of impacts on the Protestant Reformation, for one thing, and the spread of, different ideas, the challenges to the Catholic Church. This led to 150 years of religious warfare, and eventually people reconciled themselves to printing, but, it did have these negative impacts. You think about radio, television, their relationship to the rise of fascism and Stalinism. These were technologies that allowed dictators to connect to, mass audiences. And again, we've kind of figured out how to regulate and deal with those kinds of technologies. And so there's always going to be this lag between the time that the technology is introduced and the time that the society can catch up with it. And I think that in the case of biotech, it's very hard to regulate. I have a colleague at Stanford who actually works with high school students. There's a kind of standardized biotech lab that can do, different kinds of interventions, using CRISPR and so forth, that fits inside a shipping container. But a lot of high schools are having competitions, between high school students that want to do this kind of genetic manipulation. And what she does is she tries to create a set of norms that these student groups will follow, because it is impossible to monitor what they're doing. Right, this is the usual way we regulate things. So how do we regulate nuclear weapons, another dangerous technology? Well, we've got overhead satellite photographs, and we've got nuclear inspectors and so forth. And because it requires a country to actually engage in that kind of industrial production of nuclear fuel, we can pretty much monitor what's going on in North Korea, Iran, this sort of thing. With biotech, it's impossible. The technology does not require large facilities, it's very widespread, and really the only way that you can hope to regulate it is through some kind of normative, intervention that will give the researchers some standards, that they need to impose on themselves. And a lot of the work that's being done is very scary. I have another colleague at Stanford who runs a big biomedical research lab who's been he has been really worried about this. You probably are following the controversy over the lab leak, the Wuhan lab leak, which was dismissed by many people as right-wing propaganda, but now, there's a certain amount of evidence that indicates that the whole COVID epidemic was the result of just sloppy security at this Wuhan Institute of Virology, and I think that we can expect further things. So this colleague of mine has another very scary briefing about how a researcher, an American researcher, actually downloaded the genetic code for a monkeypox virus that he created in his lab. And so this is the complete merger of information technology and biotechnology. This wasn't a virus that was created from another virus. It was simply digital information that was available to anyone on the internet, and he used this to actually create a completely novel variant of monkeypox that could be actually much more virulent than the existing one. And what's going to prevent the spread of this? Well, really the only way that you can't monitor whether anyone in the world is doing this kind of research. You really need to depend on the responsibility of the organizations and the individual scientists that are working on this sort of thing. And so very hard to know, at what point somebody's going to breach some of those norms and do things that are going to be very dangerous. Now, at the end of I spent a long time in the early 2000s thinking about how to regulate biotechnology, and one thing I observed and felt was that this stuff is going to happen in Asia long before it's going to happen in Europe or in the United States, because, and frankly, this is just a cultural thing, that in countries with a Christian religious heritage, there is a belief in a fairly sharp dichotomy between human and non-human nature, and that God endowed human beings with a certain degree of dignity that non-human nature doesn't have, and this becomes the basis for a lot of our understanding of human rights, or the universality of human rights, but it also means, in a way, a kind of downgrading of the natural world on the other side of this dichotomy. And the dichotomy doesn't really exist in most Asian cultural traditions. There's a kind of continuum from non-human nature through human nature, and the ability to manipulate one spills over into the other. And indeed, China was the first country where you actually did a germline experiment on a human embryo. Now that was shut down, and the scientist that did it was punished, but I think that, those cultural inhibitions are going to be much stronger in Europe and in North America than they will be in other parts of Asia. So this is, again, this larger problem of regulating technology of any sort. You can decide to do it in your territorial jurisdiction, but it's going to happen somewhere else. And I think this is the problem now with the idea of regulating AI, that if we do it in Europe or we do it in the United States, you have this competition with China and with other big countries, and they're going to be going ahead, and you're going to ask yourself, well, are we self-limiting, this critical technology that will then be developed by somebody else and used against us? And unless you have a global regulatory scheme, we're stuck in this competition.
Mm. Well, finally, a question before we get to the audience a bit. This spring, a Norwegian scientist working on AI, I mentioned it to you, Inga Strumke, she wrote a book about machine learning and AI, and I recommend it to the audience if you haven't read it. It's sold out, but it's still possible on Kindle for the moment. She points to the European Union and to the Artificial Intelligence Act being put forward in the EU. And both she and Martin Sandbu, for instance, in the Financial Times, they say that the EU seem to be taking the right approach. What are your thoughts on the EU and what they are doing on regulation, even though you just mentioned that you have to do it worldwide and that it's difficult?
Well, compared to the United States, I think the EU is doing a lot of good work. The Digital Services Act, this new set of rules about the internet is something that we need in the United States. The EU pioneered privacy law with GDPR. We don't have that in the United States except in California and certain individual states within the United States. And I think that this American hostility to state regulation has been a big problem for the US, because we really now leave it up to these big technology companies to regulate themselves, and they're not doing that great a job. And then it turns out that, Twitter gets bought by Elon Musk, and he can change the nature of, the way they moderate content, to suit his personal and, political preferences. And that's not something that really ought to be left up to rich individuals in the private sector. This is an issue of public concern in a democracy, and so therefore laying the foundations for the ability to regulate technology is important. The problem, I think, is that we've had now a decade's worth of experience with social media, and we kind of understand now what some of the unanticipated dangers of that technology are, and therefore we have a clear regulatory target. Whether you can actually do that regulation is another question, but we have a much better idea of what the dangers are. In terms of AI, we really don't know what it is we want to worry about. Maybe deep fakes, maybe this intensified ability to target advertising, maybe the move towards general artificial intelligence, which I think is much further down the road than most people think. But again, if you think about, go back to the 1870s at the birth of electricity, and you had something like the EU at that point that said, oh, we've got this new technology, we need to constrain the bad uses of electricity and encourage the good uses of electricity, and we want to save jobs and protect people and so forth. What would they have done? And you could imagine all sorts of false moves and false directions that they would have taken that would have completely missed the target. There's this one case, for example, there was a tech guru that back in about 2015 or 16 said, if you're a radiologist, you might as well give up now, because your job is going to be taken away by artificial intelligence, because these programs are so good that they can diagnose, X-rays much better than any human being. Turns out, 7 years later, there's a shortage of radiologists, and their average incomes have gone up, because it turns out a radiologist does a lot more than simply interpret, X-rays. And I think that this is going to be, with AI, you're probably going to get similar kinds of effects. There's a question about whether the technology is going to completely replace a particular occupation, or it's going to be complementary so that it will allow people to do the same occupation but do it better. And I think in the case of radiology, it's had that effect. It actually gives the radiologist more tools, and then he or she can do other things that are connected with that particular job. That's my attitude personally about ChatGPT. It seems to me there's a lot of writing that goes on that's pretty low level, thank you letters and technical manuals and all sorts of things, and it's very possible that people with lower levels of education will be able to use ChatGPT, and they'll be able to do useful work with it. I mean, it'll be like giving them a word processor, except one that generates, a lot more words, and it may actually help people with lower levels of education do things that are useful in a, modern economy, but we don't really know what the impact is going to be, and we kind of assume the worst, that it's going to take away jobs and not simply complement them. And that's why I think that premature regulation of this technology is going to be really tricky, because we simply don't know, what the real impacts are going to be, and there is a danger of aiming at the wrong target. I do think, however, that it's worthwhile investing in a regulatory capacity, because this field is moving ahead so quickly and governments really aren't focused on it. And if you actually create a regulatory body that keeps track of the technology, I think that's something good to have in place, but I'd be a little bit careful about exactly what powers you give it, because I don't think we really know, what it should be aiming at this point.
Yeah, that's what they're mentioning, and they're also saying something about transparency, which is important as well, because you have to know what's going on inside the machines, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm not sure if we know that. So, well, let's go to the audience. My colleague here, professor of philosophy, and my colleague in Civita, Lars Fredrik Svensson. Let's see.
Thank you, Professor Fukuyama. Recent development within artificial intelligence raises all sorts of interesting questions, but I will narrow it down to one. Will the emergence of artificial intelligence undermine liberal democracy? We can assume that artificial intelligence will help authoritarian regimes and hybrid regimes suppress democratic opposition. It will assist governments in detecting unwanted information faster and more comprehensively. It will also help in censoring and otherwise neutralize such information. And such regimes will not only attempt to suppress or neutralize unwanted information domestically, but also internationally. And artificial intelligence will enhance their capacity for doing so. One could say that the introduction of artificial intelligence really doesn't bring anything new to the table. It's more of a question of efficiency. Censorship already exists by means of artificial intelligence, of course. In January this year, Russia introduced the Oculus system that monitors online information, both text and images. But what is perhaps a bigger threat is how artificial intelligence can be used to create competing content. And the competing content doesn't necessarily have to be very good. If you have enough of it, it will have the sheer amount of it will have a destructive quality. If you put enough junk into any discussion, you will ruin it. Again, artificial intelligence does perhaps not bring anything radically new to the table, but it makes such practices far easier and cheaper. And you can create digital clones, which is far easier and cheaper than making analog clones. Russian opposition politicians are used to having clone candidates with the same names running against them in elections in order to confuse voters at the polls. And artificial intelligence will make the creation of digital clones far easier, and the originals will probably just drown in a sea of fakes. Perhaps the biggest threat that these technologies pose to liberal democracy is that it's not perhaps that they will be used to suppress messages, but rather that they will make us so intellectually lazy that we will not have much of a desire to express anything of substance at all. So in brief, my question is, do you think that artificial intelligence will further accelerate democratic decline, or this recession, or do you think that there is light in the end of the tunnel?
So I think that there are two clear challenges that the current generation of artificial intelligence poses for democracy. So or maybe three. One of them is clearly the general dissolution of our certainty about information that we receive. So I've mentioned that already. That's obviously a big problem. With something like deep fakes, it's going to be very hard to know the authenticity of anything we see on the internet. But the solution to that is actually also in AI, because there are authentication technologies that can be used to actually certify the provenance of a particular digital artifact. It's just that we haven't gotten used to using that, and the amount of money going into the deep fakes is a lot more than the amount of money going into research on authentication technologies. But this is an example of where the regulation really needs to catch up with the speed of the technology, because once we recognize that there's a general problem that we can't trust anything we see, then people are going to realize that they do need, to have technological means of actually verifying that what they're seeing is a real photograph or real video, so forth. So I think it'll come, and the solution is not going to be to ban the technology as a whole. I mean, you're going to have to use the technology basically to control the technology. Now, there's another dimension of this, which is really an intensification of what already exists, which is that social media has been very good at manipulating people through targeted advertising, right? This is what Facebook and Twitter and all these other social media platforms were aiming at. And we've kind of exposed, and we're sort of aware of the commercial uses that this is being put to, but with artificial intelligence, the targeting can get smarter, it can get adaptive, so that once people realize that they're being targeted, the targeting can change, and this will be done automatically by machines and not necessarily by human beings. And I think that this is going to be a real problem, because it will open up new avenues for manipulation that are going to be very, very difficult to detect. I've been watching this on Twitter, right? So I've been a Twitter user for many years, and after Elon Musk took over, it's not that he banned certain categories of speech. He certainly allowed conservatives to get back on Twitter, but for example, the coverage of the Ukraine war really changed once he took over, and you just saw a lot less information on the pro-Ukrainian side and more things that were sympathetic to Russia. And so it's a very subtle kind of manipulation that's not obvious, at first glance, but over time it could have a cumulative effect. So I do think that that's going to be something important. On the question of totalitarian control, that's something really that I think is new. China, through its social credit system, is attempting a level of individual monitoring that has simply not been possible up until the invention of machine learning and this kind of large-scale data. You think about totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, what they could know about an individual. They tap telephones, or they'd follow people around with agents. And now China, especially after COVID, because of the integration of the COVID monitoring system with the general social control system, they know where you've been, who you've talked to. They can monitor every conversation you've had, and so forth. And that's a very powerful form of control. On the other hand, when people got tired of zero COVID, they rose up and they protested, and the authorities really had to back down. And so even that level of control didn't give the right signals to the authorities as to what they needed to do, or not until the thing broke into actual social protest. So again, it's very hard to know whether this stuff is going to work as well as we fear it will. And I think in many cases, the only solution we have is to actually use the technology to defeat the technology.
Thank you. I'm not sure if Målfrid Braut Hegghammer is here. Yes, you are there. You can come here because the microphone is here, and it's a seat for you here, so good to see you. She is professor and founding director of the Oslo Nuclear Project, and she will have a question.
Yes, hi, good morning. Sorry, coming all the way from the back. What a fascinating and important conversation. My question really picks up, I think, on where you left off, and it relates to the relative advantages of democracies and autocracies in developing and applying.
I'm sorry, can you hold your... I'm
Yeah.
having trouble hearing.
My question relates to the relative advantages of democracies and autocracies in developing and applying artificial intelligence applications. Do you see this as a winner-takes-it-all race, or do you see this as a competition where democracies and autocracies may have different areas of interests and arenas of competition? And do you think that there may be reasons to worry about the ability of democracies to compete with authoritarian regimes in some of these areas? And if so, are there things that we should do to fix that? Thank you.
You got that question?
Yeah. So whether this gives a systematic benefit to autocracy over democracy. Again, I think it's very hard to say because, there's been this dialectical process where the technology is used by a regime, for certain purposes, and then it generates a reaction, and, it sometimes negates the initial advantage that it gave people. I think that in the contest between democracy and autocracy, there are many other variables other than technology that will determine the outcome of this race. So, for example, after this, I'm going to go over to the Oslo Freedom Forum, and this is what I'm going to tell them there. There's some big disadvantages to autocratic government, among them being the fact that by concentrating decision-making power in one single individual, it means that they can make decisions quickly and very authoritatively. They are authoritarian, after all, but they can also make huge mistakes much more readily than a democratic system that spreads out decision-making, that requires consensus, consultation, deliberation, and so forth. And I think we've seen examples of both of these in Russia and China. The Ukraine invasion was something that Putin seems to have invented just by himself, not really talking to very many people, certainly not knowing very much about what Ukraine was thinking and doing, and so forth. Zero COVID was another really bad authoritarian decision that could really have only taken place in a country where you had this kind of concentrated decision-making authority in one individual. And in both cases, the leaders lost control of subsequent events, and the technology, in a way, didn't help them restore that authority. And I think that, that's the general advantage of liberal democracies, is that because they require greater social buy-in in order to produce decisions and in order to govern, they tend to be more durable. So, yes, I think the technology will give certain authoritarian countries greater control over their citizens, and they will look very strong up until the moment they collapse, because they don't really have, that kind of social support from a broad segment of their, of their societies. But, look at Venezuela. If there was ever a regime that deserved to collapse, it was probably that one, and it's still there, 2 decades after Hugo Chavez started down this road. So, it's really hard to know in the end which side is going to win this fight.
And then the last question from the audience, it's Torbjørn Røe Isaksen, who is currently a political editor of the business publication E24.
Thank you. My question is about the middle class, the economy, and liberal democracy. There's an idea going at least back to antiquity that the middle classes are a fundamental part of a functional democracy, or at least of a well-governed society. But if we're in the middle now of a technological revolution, as some say, how do you think that will impact the economy and thus also possibly impact our politics?
Right. Well, that's, it's a hard question to answer. I think the first response that many economists would give is that it's put a lot of pressure on what used to be considered the middle class. So if you think back, a European or North American democracy in the 1960s, who would be considered middle class? Well, you could be easily middle class with a high school education, working in a factory. You made enough money that you could afford, nice vacations. You could take your family out to eat with a manufacturing job, and so forth. And clearly, that kind of middle class occupation has disappeared. And part of what's happened with the rise of populism is that people with that level of education have not really participated in the huge expansion of wealth that has been created as we shifted into a kind of post-industrial, fully digitized economy. There's an easy way to think about this. If you were really good at math in the late 19th century, what would that have gotten you, in terms of your income? So you could have been an accountant, you could have been a professor in a university, but it wasn't an obvious ticket to becoming fabulously wealthy. Whereas today, if you're really good at math, you can go to Wall Street, you can work for a financial firm, make yourself a billionaire, you can do startups, you can create enormous amounts of wealth with that kind of very technical knowledge that is possessed by a pretty small part of the population. And that's been part of the, one of the drivers of inequality is that the rewards to certain kinds of cognitive ability have gone up tremendously. And, what used to be a level of cognitive ability that made you middle class, 30, 40 years ago is not going to give you the same degree of income. And that's really what's driving the populism and the inequality in our societies. Now, this is where artificial intelligence, I just don't know what the impact is going to be, because if it turns out to be a technology that simply replaces entire categories of work that had been done by lower skilled people, then it's simply going to intensify that kind of disappearance of the middle class that we've already seen up to this point. On the other hand, it may allow people with lower levels of education to do things that they weren't able to do before, because the technology will complement their kind of uniquely human abilities to relate to people, to organize things socially, to have social intelligence, and it will actually add to their incomes. But I just think at this point we don't know which of these impacts is going to be the bigger one. But that doesn't mean that we're not in a pretty problematic situation right now with the undermining of what had been middle class incomes and lifestyles that have already taken place as a result of the technologies that we've seen implemented over the last couple of generations.
Let's go to a topic that I'm sure that the audience here, or at least Norwegians in general, they are really preoccupied with the US elections, and I'm sure that you are as well, because I know we talked lots about that before. How do you think that AI technology and, the development that we see, even from 2016, will influence the forthcoming US election next year?
Well, it's complicated because we've already had this back and forth. I think that in the 2016 election, people were not aware of the potential dangers that were posed by social media. And it really took, like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where Trump was helped by targeted advertising that was done by Cambridge Analytica. They didn't realize that this could actually have a real-world impact on election outcomes. And since all American elections are dependent on like 5 swing states, and changing, 100,000 votes in those states can actually swing the election one way or the other, it potentially could be very big. And so this led to this big revolution in the way that Americans have thought about social media. So there was this recognition that these companies, these tech companies, had this power over democratic discourse, and they were misusing it because they were interested in their bottom lines and not in the health of American democracy. So this has led to a big upsurge of interest in the whole question of technology and democracy, and a backlash against the tech companies. So in 2016, all my students wanted to go work for Facebook because that's where all the big money was. And today they say, well, I had to take a job at Facebook because I couldn't find anything better than that, right? So there has been this backlash, but I don't think we've solved the underlying problem, because in a democracy, I do not think that it is legitimate to have a single large private company have that degree of influence over democratic discourse, right? It's like the situation in a certain way in the 1960s with the big broadcast channels, where you had just 3, big broadcasters, and they actually were regulated quite strictly so that they didn't get too partisan and so forth. And right now, we've got, 3 big social media companies that can have a big impact on the way people think about politics, but we don't have a regulatory structure in place that will put some limits on the kind of political speech that they can carry. And I don't see an obvious way out of this conundrum, because I don't think that you want to give it to the government, right? You don't want the government to simply dictate what are the limits of acceptable discourse, in a modern democracy. If somebody raises a question about the efficacy of vaccines, is that something we're simply going to ban, or is it, kind of legitimate question that people could raise that, in a democracy you've got to at least debate the question, and so forth. I think that's very difficult, and it's very dangerous if governments take too much of a lead. On the other hand, I don't think that it is democratically legitimate to let a private sector company exert that kind of power. Now, I led a Stanford working group on platform scale back in 2020, and we originally were going to look at antitrust, competition issues. We decided that that body of law is really primarily directed to economic impacts of large-scale corporate, concentration, and not on the impact on democracy, and that was the thing that we had to worry about. And so we spent the whole year, talking to people, deliberating about this, and we came up with a solution that I think, to my mind, is still the only one out there that I think is workable, which is something we call middleware, right? So at the present moment, the algorithm that determines what it is you see when you do a Google search, or you go on Facebook, or you go on Twitter, is a proprietary algorithm that is designed by the platform to maximize its own, benefit. And like I said, with Elon Musk, you can see the impact of this. These companies had been run by people that were kind of socially pretty liberal back in 2016, but then Musk decides he doesn't like it, and so he buys the company, and it changes, the whole direction that Twitter influences people in. That, I think, illustrates something of the problem. Like, our metaphor for this was social media is sort of like a gun that's on the table in front of you, and you're trusting that the person sitting on the other side of the table isn't going to pick up the gun and shoot you with it. but you have really no way of preventing that from happening. And in effect, that's the situation that we're in right now. Middleware would take the ability to curate content, to moderate content away from the platforms and give it to what would hopefully be a layer of smaller competitive third-party companies that would moderate the information you saw from the internet in the way that you wanted it, right? So if you leaned, conservative, you could have your Twitter feed or your Google search moderated by a conservative firm. If you were on the left, you could have a different thing. If you wanted things that were made domestically, you could have another one. You want something that will give you green content, because you're very strongly pro-environmental. You could have yet another content moderator that will serve you the tailored information. At the moment, these algorithms that we are subject to by these big companies are completely beyond our control, and they're non-transparent. We have no idea why we're being served the content we are. We have this rough idea that it's based on our past, behavior on the internet, but, who knows how they're actually deciding this. And if you had something like middleware, you would restore competition and choice to the act of moderation. The main complaint that we got about this idea was that it would reinforce the compartmentalization of political actors, so that conservatives would only see conservative content, and progressive people would only see things that they wanted to see. That's true, but I think the important thing was to take away the ability to influence political discourse on a very large scale that currently the social media platforms exercise. Where we got stymied was in the business model, because it wasn't clear how you were going to fund these companies. And it seems that people are not willing to pay for this particular service in a way that would make it something that market forces by themselves would create. And therefore, I think you have to have a regulatory environment that forces the big platforms to give up this power over content moderation and gives it to other companies that could offer consumers more choice. And right now we don't have that. But I honestly don't see a good solution to this other than trying to restore some degree of competition to the question of content moderation.
We have just a few minutes left, so the last question will be, are you, I know that in 1992 or 1989, you have been accused of being the most positive person on earth, saying it was the end of history. I know that that's not true. I know that you're actually quite pessimistic, and at least you're not. I mean, you're sober. So what are your thoughts on the AI and technology in the future? Are you optimistic a bit, or are you even more pessimistic now?
Well, I think that I do think that there has been a little bit of an overreaction to AI because of our immediate experience with social media, right? With social media, everybody began by thinking it was a great thing, and then they realized that there's a big downside to it, and now we're kind of negative on any new development. And I think that, with a lot of AI, it's premature. We just don't know what the impact is going to be, and you can see a lot of areas where it will actually be of great benefit and actually could be a benefit, to democracy. And so I'm guardedly, but I guess my more fundamental view is that we can't really stop this thing. We can regulate it, and we can try to guide it, and we can try to put limits on the misuses of it. But the nature of these technological changes is a global environment of competition, where it's very hard to hold the broader shift in technology back. So we have to get smart about it and figure out how to put some guardrails around it, but accept the fact that it's going to happen, and that we might as well benefit from the parts that we can benefit from. And that's about as much as I can say.
Thank you so much. And before we give you a big applause, I'll just say that people interested in reading what you are writing at the moment. You're writing all the time. You have a blog, really fabulous blog on American Purpose, and it's worthwhile looking into that. And of course, you're writing in all other papers as well.
Yes, and I also have a new YouTube channel.
Yeah, you have and the podcast, of course. So, and Frank is also coming to Liberal Halvtime, Civita's podcast, later this summer, and not talking about liberal democracies, but about something else.
Right.
Adam Smith. Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you for having organized this event here at the University of Oslo. Thank you so much, and thanks to Civita that wanted to have this breakfast meeting here in the Aula. Thank you.
Thank you.